Hi, I'm Tahi, and I will sum up the book Privacy's Blueprint from Chapter 4 to Chapter 6. Part 2 Design for Privacy Laws. Chapter 4 Setting the Boundaries for Design. Well, it is difficult to make laws regulating technical design. If the purpose of this law is to inspire the concept of privacy, which is notorious for being ambiguous, the difficulty will inevitably grow. If legislators do not provide sufficient guidance to companies, they risk enacting inefficient and confusing laws. However, if the rules are specific, legislators are at risk of interfering with new technologies in detail and hampering them. In that case, the rules are too comprehensive at the same time, but there is little room for appropriate application depending on the context or the requirements for competing with each other. Companies should properly arrange various considerations when developing technology. Designers must properly deal with various risk factors, such as compliance with laws and regulations, security, lukewarm market reactions, negative media reports, and competitive products. The best product design is useful and desirable and minimizes risk. Any stakeholder blueprint for privacy should be flexible enough for designers to manage all these risks and create marketable products. In order to do so, it is necessary to clarify the goal and set the boundaries necessary to achieve the goal, and set a larger border and guide it in a way that prohibits harmful design types that are placed on it. These rules should take the form of flexible standards rather than. In Chapter 4, the author proposes design boundaries for privacy laws. A legal framework is presented, and the principle of this framework is to actively utilize the standards and contents under Product Safety and Consumer Protection Act. In the second half of Chapter 4, 3-4 privacy design types are presented based on lessons mentioned in the first half. These hostile designs abuse trust, erode ambiguity, and hinder autonomous decision making. The standard-based framework for privacy design. The privacy law can serve as a guideline for design by being flexible and properly considering the context. Privacy laws should clearly indicate issues by establishing common standards rather than setting specific rules. This approach will induce companies and designers to strike a balance between industrial engineering knowledge and the competing interest. Arguing that standards are better for setting boundaries does not mean that privacy rules should do a design in a technology-neutral way. For example, it is necessary to set specific rules for malicious codes such as spyware, but universal and basic elements of technologies used by consumers such as user interfaces are wider and more flexible rules. The standard of vigilance in consumer protection, and the goal is fair information regulations. When finding a desirable design model, it is the Fair Information Regulation. The legislators see almost essentially. Fair information regulations are a common privacy state around the world. The structure and laws and regulations are already the basis for implementing fair information regulations. The fair information regulations add transparency and minimization of data collection. This is because it specifies desirable target points such as openness, security, data quality, and accountability. However, it is not suitable for setting design boundaries for information technology because it focuses on data collection, processing, and storage, but does not focus on designs that facilitate these actions. Lessons of the Product Safety Act. The most basic lesson that can be drawn from the Product Safety Act is that companies that manufacture and design dangerous goods should be responsible for the damage they cause. This is the same even if consumers misuse the product in a way that can be predicted or if there is negligence. Product safety guarantees consumer rights through justice. Through product safety rules, technology can become less dangerous and more predictable. The most important lesson that privacy laws can borrow from product safety laws is that they focus on delivering information about risk, utility, balancing requirements, and product risks to users. The risk utility balance test forces companies to examine whether the benefits of a particular design of a product are large enough to risk its users. One of the main advantages of focusing on the Product Safety Act is that people pay attention to the way they actually use technology. When determining whether the design is sufficient, it considers not only the function of the product but also people's expectations for it. One of the ways the Product Safety Act meets people's expectations is to provide manuals, warnings, and memorandum of renunciation. The Product Safety Act requires reasonable warnings, not inefficient and confusing phrase where no one can find them. This contrasts sharply with the inefficient notice and choice system of the Privacy Act. Privacy laws and regulations should prevent dangerous use of technology and should not pass on risks and responsibilities to users by requiring specific investigation and review, as in the case of Product Safety Act, beyond the formal notification, selection, and consent models. Lessons of the Consumer Protection Act. The intention of the Consumer Protection Act is to encourage accurate market information and protect market participants' vulnerabilities. The Consumer Protection Act is an ideal framework to help design agendas for privacy laws, as it focuses on power imbalances and vulnerabilities of people using technology and developed means and instruments to hold those who made products that directly damage third parties. One of the many goals of Consumer Protection Act is to prevent companies from unfairly exploiting consumer vulnerabilities. For basic dimensions should be considered: timing, when to make a notice, channel, how to deliver a message, modality, what interaction mode to use, and control, how to implement user choice. The Federal Trade Commission aims at subjects who provide means and means that can harm and deceive consumers. This means that consumers should be responsible for choosing a design that can indirectly damage them. Finally, the lessons of the Product Safety Act and Consumer Protection Act can be summarized into three rules that reflect a reasonable balance between risk and usefulness, focusing on the risks posed by people's vulnerability, noting how people actually perceive and react to things. 3. Boundary for privacy design. People's expectations and psychological models of how technology works have decisive importance. Legislators, courts, industries, and civil society should first start by considering consumer expectations in a similar way to those in the Product Safety Act and Consumer Protection Act when facing design. Therefore, it means that main boundaries for the design agenda for privacy law should focus on three things: deception, abuse, and risk. Such boundaries will help legislators and courts identify why certain designs are harmful, why some protocols are missing from design process, and why legal processes or recognitions may be appropriate. Chapter 5. Privacy Design Toolkit. Half of the author's arguments throughout the book are that the current privacy laws should better reflect the role of design that affects people's expectations and choices, while the other half should more actively guide technology design. Chapter 5 aims to develop legal tools that can be used to regulate the boundaries set in Chapter 4 and implement desired design goals. Courts, legislators, and regulators are seeking toolkits that can be referenced to transplant design agendas into privacy laws. In addition, the privacy law provides the basis of restoring the means of disclosure. In addition, the author concludes Chapter 4 recalling that legislators are not the only ones with tools to handle privacy-related designs. Since we all use technology or are within the influence of technology that uses us, we all have our own roles to play. For him, the author will provide a kind of guide on what role the general public can play so that digital technology can be developed and used as a safe and sustainable ambience. The level of intervention in the privacy design should be proportional to the threats posed by the design. The tools discussed in Chapter 4 will be introduced along a spectrum proportional to the degree of influence and control over IT companies and the severity of penalties for negative designs. When faced with privacy design problems, legislators, courts, and regulators can make all the prescriptions with moderate responses, intermediate responses, and strong responses. Moderate responses. Some of the most effective ways privacy laws can implement design agendas are moderate. This means that companies that cross the boundaries of privacy design will not be fined, whether it is an initiative that educates and supports the importance of design to the company and users. This can be achieved through education, funding, encouraging standard development, and positive and voluntary restrictions. Intermediate responses. Moderate responses are preferred by legislators, regulators, and courts, but sometimes require clearer pressure or critical views on technical design. An intermediate response is a case in which technology design itself intervenes at an intermediate level, even if a kind of fine or cost is imposed for exceeding design boundaries. The intermediate responses are more obvious and applies to more serious privacy design issues, but do not directly interfere with and control design. Strong responses. A strong response is a form of direct and serious punishment for wrong designs or directing detailed specifications of the designs. Legislators can punish specific design failures, compensate victims, and prevent negative design in the future. If a company wants a desirable design, it must establish a system that can withstand reasonable levels of failure. Direct punishment of poor designs makes engineers cringe, which narrows the room for improving the risk of use by suppressing experiments on new designs. It should be remembered that the ultimate goal of strong responses is to impose safety responsibility on designers and companies, not users. In addition, design can act as a means of privacy infringement. The theory of means should be applied carefully to prevent unfair punishment of general purpose technology with legal uses. It is a response to illegal activities to induce confidentiality infringement. Part 3. Privacy Blueprint Application. Chapter 6. Social Media. Almost all design elements of social media technology are to induce us to share as much as possible. So designers' mission is to reduce the source of friction. Here, friction refers to the transaction cost required to find and share information in social technology. Small inconveniences and efforts required every time you do something are recognized as barriers between users and app or sharing buttons. Technology that mediates communication with others almost always requires a personal exposure, captures and maintains its content. In addition, social media does not do so, even though it can protect predictable privacy rates raised by other users using design. Chapter 6 examines how social media design fails to protect privacy. First of all, it has been shown how social media design causes two privacy problems linked to each other while clearly distinguishing between platforms and people. Social media design can make us more vulnerable on both platforms and people. Social media designs were then reviewed in 5 different contexts, inducing disclosure, extracting consent, overexposure, untrustworthy friends, and online abuse. These contextual risks arise from the platform itself and others who use the service. Desirable designs can protect us from such risks in a way that creates and preserves ambiguity and fidelity that platform tells us and encourages trust between users. Above all, a good social media design should inform users of how certain technologies work, targets for information sharing, rules and risk signals of information disclosure, and thus how to use them safely and sustainably. Social media's twin threats: platform and people. The concept of design in social media refers to the actual function, structure, and appearance of technology for consumers. In the case of social media, this generally means how the user interface works and what they look like on the outside. Platforms that refer to companies that provide social media software have a vast database on concentrated electronic information. This is dangerous because of the vast scale of data collected from users and the fact that they can control their user experiences according to their conditions. It is dangerous because there are so many people on social media and so many networks that it is difficult to maintain proper boundaries. The reason that design is the core of the platform is that the user interface of social media basically serves as a channel for data. These interfaces help social media platforms such as Facebook collect more diverse and rich personal information. In short, most of the concerns about privacy on social media are the same as those corporate monitoring and big data in all behaviors. In other words, there is a concern that companies can collect, sell, and use our personal information in a way that is unfavorable to us or unexpected people. If damage occurs due to the sharing of what we will soon regret on social media, it is usually concluded that we have no way to blame ourselves. What social media promises is that we can not only choose our audience directly but also choose what to disclose online. However, the false assumption of logic attributable to individual users is that the information we share is no longer as credible that when we disclose something on social media. We are constantly capable of evaluating potential risks, and defining appropriate boundaries. The value of trust and ambiguity shows why this assumption is ridiculously wrong. And the premise that we other first assumptions have sufficient ability to assess the risk of disclosure through social media arises when people do not recognize the cognitive limitations of users properly, and many people conclude that in that way. The problem of privacy design related to the act of disclosing to others on social media can be divided into 2 major categories. First, mistakes and context collapse. First, mistakes occur when design helps or encourages users to share information in an unintended or unexpected way, and contextual collapse occurs when secret users suffer in an embarrassing and dangerous way. The damage from this type of exposure occurs almost instantly. Next, the author reviewed 5 different contexts in which privacy design is a problem on social media. Each of the 5 contexts is design that promotes disclosure, design that leads to consent, and makes people vulnerable to the platform, design that overexposes us and makes us vulnerable to both other users and platforms, design that helps unreliable friends and design that fails to aid or reduce online abuse. Privacy laws should take all of these contexts more seriously.